The night air outside the Blackwood estate carried a strange weight, thick with the scent of rain and pine, as if the entire world was holding its breath for what was about to happen inside. Clara Hayes sat in the back of the limousine. Her gloved hands clutched tightly in her lap, the lace of her wedding gown pressing against her wrists. She had never imagined her first night as a bride would feel like a funeral march, yet each passing second confirmed that this marriage was not born of love or even choice. It was duty debt and the quiet desperation of her family clinging to survival. At 22, she was supposed to be chasing dreams, not facing nightmares. When the heavy iron gates opened and the car rolled along the winding driveway, Clara's heart thudded with a dread she could not name. The mansion rose before her like a cathedral carved of shadows. It had towers and windows that reflected no light walls, that whispered of secrets too dark to survive daylight. The driver opened her door, but Clara hesitated, her legs trembling beneath the weight of satin. She took a step, and the click of her heels echoed against the marble stairs. Somewhere above, thunder cracked, as though the sky itself warned her to turn back. Inside, the corridors were dim lit only by sconces casting amber light across portraits of stern ancestors. Every footstep sounded intrusive, unwelcome, as if the house resented her presence. Two maids hurried past carrying folded linens, their heads bent together in hushed conversation. Clara caught the murmur, faint but clear enough to wound. One whispered to the other, "He broke his last wife on their wedding night." The words sliced through her composure like glass. She froze her hand, clutching the banister, as though it might hold her upright. Her mind spiraled with questions she dared not ask. Was it rumor, exaggeration, or cruel truth? She wanted to demand clarity, but the maids disappeared down the hall, leaving her alone with the echo of their words. The phrase repeated in her head, heavy and relentless, broke his last wife. Clara had heard enough stories about Alexander Blackwood to know that his cold reputation was not a fabrication. Business articles called him the Ice King. Employees described him as ruthless, efficient, without a trace of warmth. Yet she had agreed, or rather been forced to agree, to bind herself to him because her father had begged, because debts had piled too high, because this was the only way to save her family's failing company. Clara's breath caught when she reached the door to the master suite. It was tall carved oak, looming like the entrance to a tomb. She swallowed hard and pushed it open. The room inside was grand and sterile, decorated in shades of gray and black, with a fire flickering in the hearth that gave off little warmth. A crystal chandelier sparkled overhead, but seemed almost mocking in its beauty. Then she saw him. Alexander Blackwood stood near the fireplace, his broad shoulders outlined by the firelight. He was dressed in a black suit jacket, unbuttoned tie, discarded, yet there was nothing relaxed in his posture. He looked carved from marble, severe jawline hair, dark as ink, eyes sharp enough to slice through her trembling composure. Those eyes landed on her, and Clara felt as if every fragile defense she had built collapsed in an instant. For a moment there was only silence. The flames crackled, the storm outside whispered against the glass, and Clara's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then he spoke, his voice, deep and cold, a blade cloaked in velvet. "You're trembling. Good. Fear keeps people honest." The words struck her harder than the maid's whisper. Honest. What honesty could she offer him when she was here only because she was a pawn? in a deal struck between men. She wanted to protest, to insist she was not afraid, but her lips refused to move. He watched her with an unreadable expression, one hand sliding into his pocket, the other resting lightly on the mantel, as though he had all the time in the world to watch her squirm. Clara took a cautious step into the room, her gown brushing across the polished floor. The train of lace trailed behind her like the tether of a prisoner. She forced her voice steady, though it cracked against her will. I came because my family needed me to. It was a pitiful truth, but the only one she had. Alexander tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity or disdain. His silence pressed against her, thickening the air until she felt she might suffocate under it. The fire popped sparks leaping upward like frightened birds. Clara's knees threatened to give way, but she refused to collapse. She would not let him see her break, not on this night, not when everything inside her screamed that she was already broken. The distance between them felt impossible, though only a few steps separated her from the hearth where he stood. Clara clutched the edge of her veil, twisting the fabric between her fingers. She thought of her mother gone too soon, who had once told her that fear could be fought by standing tall. But her mother had never faced a man like Alexander Blackwood. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though it burned like staring into ice. "Do you expect me to fear you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt at courage. A faint curve touched his lips, not a smile but something colder. "Expectation is irrelevant," he replied. "Fear is instinct. You already feel it." The words dropped like stones in her stomach. Her heart pounded so loud she was certain he could hear it. She wanted to run, to flee into the storm and never return, but her father's pleading voice chained her in place. This was her duty. This was her cage. And now she was locked inside with the man the world called the Ice King. The fire snapped again, casting light across his face. For an instant, Clara thought she saw something flicker there, something human, a shadow of weariness. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the mask of control he wore like armor. He turned slightly, lifting a crystal glass from the table, sipping amber liquid without breaking eye contact. Clara's throat was dry, her palms clammy inside silk gloves. She took another step forward, then another, until the gap between them closed to only a few feet. The flames painted his features in gold and shadow, making him appear both angelic and demonic. He set down the glass and spoke again, softer this time, but no less piercing. "You entered my house, knowing who I am. Do not pretend surprise when I am exactly that." Her lips parted, but no answer came. She realized then that the horror was not only in his words, but in the truth they carried. She was no longer Clara Hayes, the girl with sketchbooks and hidden dreams. She was Mrs. Blackwood bride to a man colder than stone, bound by vows spoken under chandeliers and the heavy weight of obligation. Outside the storm raged lightning cutting across the sky, thunder rolling like a warning drum. Inside, Clara stood at the edge of a night. She could not escape her body, trembling her heart, racing her soul, whispering prayers into silence. The maid's words haunted her, still echoing in every flicker of firelight. He broke his last wife. Would she be next? She did not know. She only knew that this night, this man and this house had already swallowed her whole. Clara stood frozen in the firelit room, her pulse hammering in her ears, as Alexander Blackwood's words echoed in the silence. "Fear keeps people honest." She felt as if the walls of the suite were closing in, as though her very skin was too tight for the dread crawling beneath it. This was the night she had dreaded since the engagement was announced, the night whispered about in every corner of her mind. Her father had insisted it was necessary her siblings had looked away, and now she was here facing the man the world called the Ice King. She expected him to advance to demand his rights to claim her as nothing more than a transaction fulfilled. Her breath shook as he set down the glass, the ice clinking softly against crystal. He turned toward her, each step deliberate, his gaze locked to hers, and Clara braced herself as though for impact. Her fingers clenched the veil so tightly the lace nearly tore. The sound of the storm outside seemed to sync with her heartbeat, louder, faster, building toward something inevitable. Alexander stopped only inches from her, his presence overwhelming. She closed her eyes, the weight of expectation pressing down like stone. But then she felt something unexpected, warmth, fabric, the soft brush of wool over her shoulders as he slipped his jacket from his body and draped it around her trembling frame. Clara's eyes flew open in shock. He was not reaching for her as she had feared. Instead, he was covering her, shielding her from the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The fire crackled louder, as if mocking her confusion. Alexander's hands lingered only long enough to settle the coat around her, then fell back to his sides. He did not touch her skin. He did not demand anything. He only looked at her expression unreadable, as though weighing something in the balance of silence. Clara struggled to breathe, words tangling on her tongue. I don't understand, she whispered. His reply was calm, deliberate, spoken with the authority of someone who did not waste breath on empty words. Everyone thinks this night is mine, he said. His voice carried a low, steady resonance that seemed to vibrate against the walls. They are wrong. It is yours. You set the rules here. Clara's lips parted in disbelief. She had prepared for humiliation, for pain, for the cold inevitability of being claimed by a man she did not know. What she had not prepared for was choice. The storm rattled the windows, but inside the room time slowed. She studied his face, searching for cruelty, for mockery, for a smirk that would confirm this was another kind of game. Instead, she found only the steel of restraint, the discipline of a man used to controlling not only his empire but himself. He turned away before she could respond, moving to the mantel where he reached up and pinched the flame of a candle between his fingers. The light sputtered and dyed shadows stretching across the suite. He moved to the next, extinguishing them one by one, until the room was lit only by the fire in the hearth. The intimacy of the gesture unnerved her more than any threat could have. Clara clutched the jacket closer to her chest, inhaling the faint scent of cedar and smoke that clung to it. Her mind reeled. Was this another form of control giving her the illusion of power? Or was it something else entirely? He turned back to her now, standing in the glow of the fireplace, his features softened by shadow. His eyes found hers again, piercing but no longer cruel. "You will not be touched tonight," he said, each word measured. "Not until you want me to." Clara swayed as if the floor beneath her had shifted. The jacket weighed heavy on her shoulders, yet she felt lighter than she had since the vows were spoken. She could scarcely process the contradiction. This man painted by the world as ruthless feared, by employees hated by rivals, had just offered her something no one else in her life ever had: control, choice, respect. For a long moment she could not speak. The storm outside filled the silence rain drumming against the glass. Finally she found her voice faint and uneven. Why, it was the only question that mattered. Alexander's jaw tightened, his gaze steady. "Because fear may keep people honest," he said, his tone softer than before, "but respect keeps them whole. I will not break what is not mine to break." Clara's chest constricted, her breath catching on a sob she refused to release. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that beneath the ice there was something human. But trust was dangerous, and she had already surrendered too much by standing here. Yet her heart, traitorous and desperate, whispered that perhaps the horror she had been promised was not the horror she would receive. Alexander stepped back, granting her space, his presence receding like the tide. He lifted the crystal glass once more, sipping quietly, as though the conversation was over, as though he had said all that needed to be said. Clara remained rooted to the floor, her body trembling, her mind racing. The whispers of the maids returned, but now they tangled with his words. He broke his last wife. You set the rules here, two truths colliding, impossible to reconcile. She pulled the jacket tighter, grounding herself in its warmth. She realized with startling clarity that the man before her was not the monster she had been led to fear, nor the savior she secretly longed for. He was something more dangerous. He was unpredictable. The storm thundered again, shaking the windows. Clara finally took a step back, retreating toward the edge of the bed. Her heart pounded, her thoughts a chaos of fear and fragile hope. The firelight danced across Alexander's profile. As he stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. For the first time that night, Clara wondered if perhaps the horror was not in the man himself, but in the walls they both carried within. She sat at the edge of the bed, his jacket wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze never leaving him. She whispered a prayer to the storm, not for escape, but for strength. This night had not gone as she expected. It had not destroyed her, nor had it healed her. It had given her something she had not dared to imagine: time. And in that fragile gift, Clara felt the first flicker of something she could not yet name. Something as dangerous and powerful as the lightning tearing the sky outside. The days that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm that felt more like living with a ghost than with a husband. Clara moved through the endless corridors of the Blackwood estate, her footsteps muffled by Persian rugs, her presence absorbed by the walls that seemed to have witnessed centuries of secrets. Alexander was there, and not there all at once, his existence marked by the faint click of polished shoes on marble, the low murmur of his voice in phone calls conducted behind closed doors, and the smell of expensive cologne that lingered long after he left a room. They spoke little, and when they did, his words were clipped, efficient, never careless. At breakfast, he sat at the opposite end of a long dining table, the silence stretching wider than the polished mahogany. He read the financial section of the paper while she stirred her tea, her spoon clinking in the porcelain cup, the only sound between them. Sometimes she glanced at him, trying to decode the man who had terrified her on their wedding night, only to wrap her in his jacket and extinguish the candles as if he were sparing her. He caught her eyes once and held them, but instead of speaking, he returned to his paper, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined any softness at all. At night she lay awake in the vast bed, listening for his approach, but the door to his adjoining chamber remained closed. The house staff treated her with the careful politeness of people who knew their positions depended on discretion. Still, Clara noticed details that contradicted the reputation of the Ice King. Every evening when she left her study, the hall light was on, though she never turned it herself. When she tried to move a heavy chair in the library, she found it already adjusted to her height the next morning. At dinner, though they ate in silence, she discovered that her favorite dishes appeared on the menu more often than coincidence could explain. She began to suspect that Alexander observed her more than he let on. One rainy afternoon, she found herself in the music room, fingers brushing the dust from the ivory keys of a grand piano. She hesitated before pressing a note, the sound trembling through the air like a fragile memory. When she looked up, she caught sight of him leaning against the doorway. He did not interrupt or comment, simply inclined his head once before disappearing again. The moment left her unsettled, as though he had acknowledged a part of her no one else cared to see. Life with Alexander was a study in contradictions. He was cold but considerate absent, but ever-present silent but watchful. Clara realized she had been given not a partner but a puzzle. Every piece she found deepened her curiosity instead of satisfying it. Her fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more complex. A restless need to understand the man who had given her power she had never expected and distance she had never requested. The mansion itself mirrored their relationship, vast and intimidating, yet filled with small details that revealed unexpected warmth. Flowers appeared in the drawing room vases each week, their colors bright against the muted walls. The garden outside her window was tended daily roses pruned with precision. Even the library shelves bore signs of use, certain volumes worn from repeated handling. She wondered which belonged to him, which to his late mother, which to no one at all. Though he remained elusive, she began to sense a quiet protectiveness in the way he moved around her life. Once, when she attempted to carry a tray of tea herself, a butler rushed forward nervously, whispering that Mr. Blackwood had ordered that she was never to lift more than she wished. Another time, when she mentioned in passing that the estate felt draughty, the following night she found a new blanket folded neatly at the foot of her bed, heavier and warmer than the last. Clara lay beneath it, staring at the ceiling, torn between gratitude and frustration. Gratitude because the gestures proved he cared, frustration because he refused to let her see it openly. What was he afraid of? That night she dreamed of the storm, on their wedding evening of his words that chilled and soothed all at once. You set the rules here. She awoke before dawn, her hand still clutching the blanket he had chosen. The room was dark, except for the faint glow from the hallway light left on again, steady as a promise. Clara closed her eyes and realized she was no longer certain who Alexander Blackwood truly was. Stranger, protector, enemy, or something else entirely? The question consumed her more with each passing day, and though silence surrounded them, her heart whispered that perhaps the answer would come not in what he said, but in what he did. Clara's curiosity sharpened into something heavier the morning she ventured beyond the estate's walls and discovered Alexander in a place she never imagined. She had told the driver she wanted to see the city to escape the suffocating silence of the mansion, and though he hesitated, he obeyed. The car stopped outside a private hospital, where Alexander's name was etched into the donor plaque by the entrance. Clara entered half hidden beneath a scarf and followed a corridor where hushed voices and antiseptic scents filled the air. At the end of the hall she saw him, the man whose reputation froze boardrooms, sitting quietly beside a frail woman in a wheelchair. His hand rested gently over hers, his voice low, coaxing a smile from someone who barely seemed to recognize him. The woman mumbled words lost in confusion, her eyes clouded by Alzheimer's, and still Alexander listened as if each syllable was treasure. Clara stood frozen, the sight carving deep into her chest. This was not the Ice King she had married, but a son, or perhaps a lost boy, clinging to the last thread of family. She turned away before he noticed her, her heart rattled by the crack she had glimpsed in his armor. Later that week, the rain slicked the marble steps of the estate, and Clara, distracted by her thoughts, slipped. The fall should have left her bruised and humiliated, but before she hit the floor, strong arms wrapped around her. Alexander caught her with a swiftness that contradicted his composed demeanor. For a moment she was pressed against him, her breath tangled with his eyes wide with something she had never seen before. Fear, not for himself but for her. He set her upright carefully, his hands steady, even as his jaw clenched. "You should be more careful," he muttered, but his tone was not chastisement. It was concern, disguised as irritation. Clara's knees wobbled, not from the fall, but from the revelation that beneath his cold exterior he was capable of care. That night she replayed the moment in her mind, the way his hands had lingered longer than necessary, the way his eyes softened before he forced them hard again. She tried to tell herself it was instinct reflex, nothing more. Yet the memory warmed her in a way no blanket could. Days bled into nights, and each time she observed him, she noticed new fissures in the ice. A pause in his stride when she laughed unexpectedly at a book she was reading. A quiet sigh when he thought he was alone in the study. The faintest twitch of his lips when she thanked a servant by name. These glimpses were fleeting, vanishing the moment she looked directly at him, but they existed, undeniable and persistent. One evening she wandered into the kitchen long after dinner. To her surprise, Alexander was there, sleeves rolled up, pouring himself a glass of water. For a heartbeat, they stood in awkward silence, two strangers bound by vows, but divided by walls. She reached for a glass, fumbling, and it slipped from her hand. Before it shattered on the floor, he caught it with startling speed, his hand brushing hers. Electricity sparked in the contact, brief but undeniable. She whispered a thank you, her cheeks burning, and he only nodded before leaving. But the echo of that touch lingered long after he disappeared down the hall. Clara began to realize that every act of distance carried within it an unspoken contradiction. He was always near enough to notice, to protect, to intervene, yet far enough to deny the truth of his presence. He was a man fighting himself, and in that battle she saw not cruelty, but pain. One night, restless, she wandered the halls and found herself outside his study. The door was ajar, and inside Alexander sat at his desk, head bowed, hand pressed to his temple. Papers lay scattered, his tie loosened his expression, stripped of the steel he wore in public. He looked human, exhausted, vulnerable. She almost entered, almost offered comfort, but fear held her back. Instead, she watched silently until he straightened the mask, returning the door closing with finality. Clara retreated to her room, her chest aching with a strange mixture of pity and longing. The horror she had feared on her wedding night had not come. What came instead was this, the slow, disorienting discovery that the coldest man she had ever met carried warmth he refused to release. It unsettled her more than any cruelty could have, because it made her hope. And hope, Clara knew, was more dangerous than fear. For once hope took root, it demanded more. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of his words again. You set the rules here. Perhaps she thought those rules could break the ice. The transformation began not with declarations or grand gestures, but with something as simple as food. One Saturday afternoon, Clara found herself restless pacing the garden paths when Alexander appeared unexpectedly. He did not ask what troubled her, only suggested a drive. She agreed more out of curiosity than desire, and soon she was in the passenger seat of his vintage Mustang, the engine rumbling with restrained power. The city blurred past in streaks of sunlight and shadow until he pulled into a crowded street lined with food trucks. Clara blinked in disbelief as he parked among college kids and families balancing paper plates. She had expected a private restaurant or a five-star dining hall, not the scent of grilled cheese and roasted peppers drifting through the air. Alexander stepped out his presence as commanding here as in any boardroom, yet he seemed oddly at ease. When Clara hesitated, he opened her door himself, extending his hand with a quiet steadiness that surprised her. She took at their palms, brushing, and followed him to a bright red truck, painted with cartoon flames. He ordered 2 sandwiches and lemonade, his voice casual, almost warm. They ate standing on the curb, the cheese stretching in gooey strings. And for the first time since the wedding, Clara laughed. It slipped out unguarded, startled from her chest by the absurdity of seeing the Ice King struggle with dripping bread. Alexander froze, then allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch into something that might have been a smile. That fleeting crack in his mask was worth more to Clara than jewels. After that day, small rituals grew between them. He discovered she loved sunsets, so one evening he drove her to the cliffs above the ocean. They sat on the hood of the Mustang, the salt air tangling her hair, while the sky burned orange and violet. He said nothing, but the silence was not heavy. It was companionable, woven with the unspoken understanding that some beauty needed no words. Another time she found a Polaroid camera left on her desk with no note. She recognized his handwriting on the box, the simple phrase written in ink, "Capture what matters." She laughed softly, touched by the unexpected gift, and began snapping photos of everything: the rose garden, the stray cat that prowled the estate, the rare instances when Alexander's face softened in concentration. One evening she dared to point the camera at him when he was unaware, capturing him with his tie-undone hair, slightly disheveled eyes far away in thought. When she showed him the photo, he stared at it longer than expected, as if unaccustomed to seeing himself unguarded. Clara treasured the growing collection, each photo a thread weaving them closer. They began sharing meals more often, not across endless tables, but side by side in the smaller breakfast room. Once she tried cooking pancakes, a disastrous attempt that left flour everywhere. Alexander walked in mid-chaos, eyebrows raised at the mess. Instead of scolding her, he rolled up his sleeves and helped salvage the meal, flipping pancakes with surprising skill. They ate together, laughing at the lopsided results, and Clara realized that joy could bloom even in burnt edges and sticky counters. On a quiet Sunday, she asked about his favorite music, expecting silence, but he surprised her by turning on an old record player. Soft jazz filled the study, the trumpet notes curling through the air like smoke. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, and Clara watched him with fascination. For once, his features looked peaceful, stripped of tension. She found herself sketching him in her notebook, capturing the rare moment when the world's coldest man looked almost tender. When he noticed the drawing, he studied it carefully, his voice low. "You make me look kinder than I am." She met his gaze and whispered, "Maybe you are kinder than you let yourself be." He said nothing, but she saw the truth ripple through his eyes. Bit by bit, the mansion changed. What had once been a cage began to feel like a home, not because the walls softened, but because the space between them filled with ordinary intimacy. He would pass her in the hall and place a book into her hands, saying only, "You might like this." She would leave a Polaroid tucked into his briefcase, a candid shot of the garden, a reminder that life was more than mergers and meetings. Clara began to feel alive again, her laughter less foreign, her heart less heavy. Yet beneath the warmth lingered questions she dared not ask. Why had he given her choice that first night? Why did he protect her from the shadows, yet refuse to step fully into the light with her? The answers remained locked behind his eyes, but the cracks in the ice widened daily, and Clara could not help but believe that one day the entire facade might shatter. As she lay in bed one night, flipping through Polaroids of sunsets, pancakes, and half smiles, she realized that what terrified her on her wedding night was not horror at all. It was the possibility of hope. And hope she thought was more dangerous than fear because it demanded she keep reaching for more. The evening that shifted everything began with a storm that kept Clara awake long after midnight. Rain lashed against the windows of her bedroom, thunder rolling like distant drums, but what unsettled her most was the quiet inside the house. The Blackwood estate was rarely peaceful, filled with the steady movement of staff and the sharp edges of Alexander's presence. Yet that night it felt suspended in an uneasy stillness. Clara rose from bed wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and wandered into the dimly lit hallway. She found herself outside the study, the door ajar, light spilling into the corridor. She hesitated, but curiosity drew her closer, and when she peeked inside, she saw Alexander sitting at the desk, his tie loosened. His head bowed into his hands, papers were scattered across the surface. The fire beside him reduced to embers. He looked not like the unshakable Ice King, but a man burdened by ghosts. Clara stepped into the room, the floor creaking slightly. His head lifted, eyes narrowing for an instant before softening when he recognized her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. She shook her head and moved closer, unsure if she was intruding, but unwilling to retreat. For a moment they sat in silence, the storm filling the gap between them. Finally, Clara whispered, "I used to draw when I couldn't sleep. It was my escape." Alexander's gaze lingered on her, prompting her to continue. She spoke of her childhood of nights, spent in a small apartment above her father's failing store, of sketchbooks filled with dreams she could never afford to chase. She told him how her mother's laughter used to fill the rooms, before illness took her away, leaving behind a silence that never healed. Her voice cracked when she admitted she had agreed to this marriage, not because of duty alone, but because she had believed perhaps love might find her even in the strangest of places. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, absorbing every word as if storing them carefully. When she finished, she expected dismissal, maybe even mockery, but instead he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as though releasing years of restraint. "I never believed in escape," he said finally, his tone low and steady. "When I was a boy, my father taught me that weakness invited ruin. My mother tried to shield me, but he broke her spirit until she left. I told myself I didn't care, that I didn't need her, but the truth is I never forgave myself for not protecting her." Clara's breath caught at the rawness in his words. He rarely revealed anything personal, yet now he laid bare wounds carved deep into his past. His hands clenched on the armrest knuckles, white as if even memory demanded control. "I learned to survive by freezing everything inside," he continued. "Feel nothing, want nothing. Build an empire and no one can hurt you." His voice faltered, and Clara realized she was witnessing a confession he had never shared with anyone. Tentatively, she reached across the desk, placing her hand over his. The contact startled him, his muscles tensing, but he did not pull away. His eyes dropped to her hand, delicate against his scarred knuckles, and for once he allowed the silence to stretch without filling it with walls. Clara whispered, "You are not weak for feeling. You are human." His jaw tightened as if the word itself was foreign. And if being human means losing everything he asked, bitterness lacing his tone. She held his gaze, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then at least you lived. At least you loved." Something fractured in his expression, a vulnerability he fought to suppress but could not fully conceal. The storm outside crashed louder, lightning casting fleeting brightness across his face. He looked younger in that moment, less a titan and more a man who had carried too much for too long. Clara squeezed his hand gently, offering the reassurance she wished someone had given him years ago. He closed his eyes briefly, and when they opened again, there was a softness she had never seen before. "You think love is enough," he murmured. Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I think love is the only thing that ever was." The words hung between them, fragile yet unyielding, and though neither spoke further, something shifted in the room. The storm raged outside, but inside the study, a fragile peace settled. They sat together until the fire died completely, her hand still over his, their silence no longer a barrier, but a bond. Later, as Clara returned to her room, her heart ached with both hope and fear. She knew now that the horror of her wedding night had not been Alexander himself, but the walls he had built. And she knew also that those walls were beginning to crack. She lay awake, clutching the shawl around her shoulders, replaying his words, the confession of a boy who had become a king of ice to survive. For the first time since the vows were spoken, she believed that perhaps buried beneath the frost, Alexander Blackwood possessed a heart capable of warmth. She drifted into sleep with the storm still raging, but her dreams were gentler, filled not with dread, but with the possibility of healing. The days following their midnight confessions felt different, though neither Clara nor Alexander openly acknowledged it. The silence between them was no longer suffocating, but threaded with unspoken understanding. She caught him watching her sometimes, his eyes less guarded, and when she smiled in return, he did not turn away as quickly. Yet just as warmth began to bloom, the chill of reality crept back in the form of Richard Blackwood. The patriarch arrived one afternoon, without warning, his presence filling the estate with a heaviness Clara could not ignore. He strode into the great hall with a cane more for theatrics than need his tailored suit, immaculate his gaze, sharp enough to slice through marble. Clara stood at the top of the staircase when he entered, and for a fleeting second their eyes locked. She saw no kindness in him, only calculation. Richard dismissed her with a flicker of disinterest before focusing on his son. Alexander's posture stiffened, the mask of the Ice King snapping back into place. Father and son retreated to the study, the door closing like a gavel, and Clara paced the hall outside, straining to hear. Their voices rose, muffled, but distinct enough to make her stomach twist. Richard's tone was cold, commanding. "You forget yourself, Alexander. Marriage is not about sentiment. It is about leverage. This girl is a pawn, nothing more. Do not confuse convenience with affection." Alexander's response was lower, a growl beneath his words. "She is my wife." Richard scoffed, his laughter echoing through the wood panels. "Your wife is a tool. You do not marry for love. You marry for power. And if you let emotion cloud your judgment, I will remind you how quickly pawns can be removed from the board." Clara's chest constricted, each word stabbing deeper. She pressed her hand to the door, fighting tears, knowing she should not be listening, but unable to move. The threat in Richard's voice was not subtle. If Alexander allowed himself to care, Clara would pay the price. She staggered back when the voices fell silent, retreating before they emerged. Alone in her room, she collapsed onto the bed, clutching the Polaroids she had begun to treasure. The picture of Alexander, half smiling by the food truck, blurred through her tears. She had thought she was breaking through his walls, that perhaps love could take root in barren ground. But Richard's words were a brutal reminder that she was never meant to matter. She was currency payment for her father's debts, a means to an end. That evening, Alexander entered her room. He looked as composed as always, but she noticed the tension in his jaw, the faint crease between his brows. "You should rest," he said simply. She forced her voice to remain steady. "Am I just leverage to you?" The question sliced the air like lightning. His eyes darkened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then softly, "That is what my father wants you to be." It was not an answer, and yet it was. Clara's throat ached. "And what do you want?" He hesitated, a battle raging in his expression, then turned away. "What I want is irrelevant." The words gutted her more than cruelty ever could. She whispered, "I thought I saw something real in you." He froze but did not face her. Instead, he left, closing the door behind him with finality. Clara sank onto the floor, her body trembling, the echo of Richard's threats suffocating her. The cracks in Alexander's ice had revealed warmth, but now she feared it was warmth that could never reach her. The next days passed in a blur of avoidance. Alexander buried himself in work, rarely appearing outside the study. When he did, he was cold, polite, untouchable. Clara wandered the estate aimlessly, her hope withering under the weight of doubt. Every glance at the Polaroids hurt, every memory of laughter tainted by the reminder that she was nothing more than a pawn. One evening she found herself back in the music room, hands trembling on the piano keys. She played softly a melody her mother had once sung. The notes wavered, breaking with her tears. She sensed Alexander at the doorway, but did not stop. When the final chord faded, she whispered without looking at him, "I will not be your father's pawn." The silence stretched before he finally spoke, his voice a mix of anger and despair. You don't understand the danger. She turned eyes fierce through her tears. Then make me understand, or let me go. His face was unreadable, but she saw the war inside him. He wanted to protect her, yet refused to admit he cared. And in that refusal lay her answer. She rose from the piano, wiping her eyes, and whispered, "If you cannot choose me over him, I will choose myself." With that, she left the room, her footsteps echoing through the halls, each step pulling her further from the fragile hope she had built. In the silence that followed, Alexander stood rooted in place, the mask on his face hiding the truth that behind it his heart was breaking too. The confrontation with Richard and the silence that followed of Clara Hollow. The mansion that had begun to feel less like a cage and more like a home now suffocated her with every echo of her footsteps. She could not erase Richard's words from her mind, could not forget Alexander's refusal to answer when she asked what he wanted. Days turned into weeks of half-spoken sentences and cold nods across the dining table. Alexander seemed determined to bury himself in work papers and phone calls replacing conversation. The study door locked more often than not. Clara tried to reach him at first, waiting in the music room with the Polaroid camera, cooking small meals in the hope he would join her, but he did not come. Each rejection cut deeper until she stopped trying altogether. The hope she had nurtured with food trucks and sunset drives shriveled into something bitter. One night she confronted him in the hallway, her voice trembling with both rage and despair. "I won't be a pawn in your father's game," she said. He froze his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with something unspoken, but he did not argue. He only said, "You are safer if you stay." The words shattered her. Safer was not love. Safer was not choice. Safer was another cage with gilded bars. "Then I'd rather risk danger than live like this," she whispered, her voice breaking. She walked past him, her gown brushing against his suit, the distance between them widening with each step. Alexander did not follow. His fists clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms, but he remained still as marble. In that moment, Clara realized he would not fight for her. Perhaps he believed it was for her protection. Perhaps he feared his father too deeply, but either way, the result was the same. She was alone. The next morning, she packed a small suitcase, placing her Polaroids carefully inside. The roses in the garden swayed in the breeze as she descended the steps, her heart heavy yet resolute. The driver looked shocked when she told him to take her to the train station, but he obeyed without question. Clara did not look back at the mansion. She could not bear the thought of Alexander standing at a window, watching her leave, doing nothing to stop her. The city was loud, chaotic, and indifferent, but in its noise, she found a strange sense of freedom. She rented a small apartment near the art district, its walls bare and humble, nothing like the grand halls of the Blackwood estate. For the first time in months, she breathed without feeling the weight of expectation pressing down. Yet even in her newfound independence, Alexander haunted her. Every time she picked up a pencil, her sketches turned into his profile. The crease in his brow, the rare softness of his half-smile. She tore the pages from her notebook in frustration, scattering them across the floor, but the images returned again and again. Nights were worst. She lay awake, clutching the Polaroid camera, scrolling through the photos she had taken. His laugh caught mid-bite at the food truck, his gaze on the horizon. At the cliffs, the blurred candid of him pouring coffee in the kitchen. Each picture was a reminder, of what could have been if only he had chosen differently. She told herself she hated him, that she was better without him, but the ache in her chest betrayed her. Across town, Alexander sat alone in his study, the fire burning low. Papers lay untouched, deals forgotten. His thoughts consumed by the emptiness left in Clara's absence. He had watched her leave unseen from an upper window, every instinct screaming to run after her. But his father's warning echoed in his mind. Pawns can be removed. He believed keeping his distance would keep her safe, but the silence hollowed him out until even victory tasted of ash. He poured whiskey into a glass, but could not drink the burn in his chest, greater than any liquor could provide. He opened the drawer of his desk and found the Polaroid she had slipped inside weeks earlier, a photo of the rose garden in bloom. He stared at it until his vision blurred, his fingers trembling. For the first time in years, Alexander Blackwood admitted to himself that he was afraid not of his father, not of failure, but of losing the one person who had seen through his ice and touched the man beneath. And yet he had let her go. Clara, in her tiny apartment, pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window as rain fell outside. Alexander, in his cavernous study, sat hunched beneath the weight of his own choices. They were two people separated by silence, each pretending that distance was safety, while both drowning in the truth that separation was the cruelest danger of all. The night it all came crashing down began with a phone call Clara never expected. She was leaving her small apartment raincoat pulled tight against the drizzle when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. A voice she did not recognize warned her in clipped tones to stay away from the main street near the train station. The line went dead before she could respond. Confused but unsettled, she changed her path, only to find herself cornered in a narrow alley by two men in dark suits. Their words were cold, deliberate, unmistakably tied to Richard Blackwood. "You should have stayed in your cage," one hissed. Before she could cry out, they shoved her back the world, spinning as she stumbled against the slick pavement. At that moment, headlights cut through the rain, and the roar of an engine filled the alley. A black Mustang screeched to a halt, and Alexander emerged like a storm given flesh. His fists collided with the men. Before Clara could blink, his fury unrestrained his usually composed expression. Fractured by raw fear, the attackers fled into the night, leaving him standing there, chest-heaving rain, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He turned to Clara, his eyes wild, his voice breaking. "I thought fear would protect me," he said, breath ragged. "But losing you is the only real horror." Clara's body trembled, both from the encounter and from the force of his confession. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands cupping her face with desperate tenderness. She stared up at him, tears mingling with raindrops, her heart cracking open at last. "You left me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You let me believe I didn't matter." His forehead pressed against hers, his words spilling out like a dam broken. "I thought pushing you away would keep you safe. My father made threats and I believed him. But the truth is, I was a coward, too afraid of losing control, too afraid of needing someone. You are not leverage. You are not a pawn. You are everything." The rain fell harder, thunder crashing above them, but in that narrow alley, the world shrank to just the two of them. Clara's sob turned into a laugh, shaky and wet, as she clutched at his jacket. "I don't need protection from you. I need the truth. I need you." He kissed her then, fierce and unrestrained, the storm around them, paling in comparison to the storm between their lips. It was not graceful, it was not practiced, but it was real. Years of ice shattered in that kiss, and for the first time Alexander allowed himself to be vulnerable, to be human, to be hers. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads still pressed together, he whispered, "I will fight him. I will fight anyone who tries to take you from me." Clara searched his eyes, finding no mask there, only raw honesty. "And I will not run again," she said. The alley glistened with water, and light, the rain, cascading like a curtain around them, but they stood rooted, unshaken. Alexander gathered her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, carrying her to the car. She did not protest, resting her head against his chest, listening to the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. For once it matched her own. The drive back to the estate was silent, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two souls who had finally confessed the truth, who no longer needed to fill the air with pretense. When they arrived, Clara looked at the looming mansion and felt no fear. Not because the house had changed, but because she was no longer facing it alone. Alexander helped her inside his hand, never leaving hers. The fire roared in the hearth as he guided her into the great hall. "This ends tonight," he said firmly, his voice no longer the icy tone of the Ice King, but the steady promise of a man who had chosen love over fear. For Clara, the horror of her wedding night seemed like a memory from another life. What had once been a story of dread was now transformed into something far more dangerous and far more precious: hope. She looked at him, her heart aching with fierce clarity, and whispered, "Then let us end it together." In his answering gaze, she saw the truth. The Ice King had melted, and what remained was a man willing to burn the world if it meant keeping her safe. The fire in the great hall burned high, throwing shadows that danced across the marble floor, as Alexander led Clara into the room with a steadiness that surprised even him. He had lived his life in control, in silence, in ice, yet tonight the facade had cracked beyond repair. Clara stood before him, her hair damp from the storm, her eyes luminous with both fear and hope. He reached for her hand, rough fingers trembling as they enclosed her delicate ones, and whispered words that carried more weight than any vow spoken at their wedding. "I almost lost you because I thought distance was protection. I almost destroyed us because I thought love was weakness. But I was wrong. I will never let you believe again that you are a pawn. You are my choice, my heart, my beginning." Her breath caught, and she lifted her free hand to his cheek, tracing the stubble there with a tenderness that made his chest ache. "I was afraid of this night," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Afraid of you, afraid of myself, afraid of the world. But I am not afraid anymore. Not if it's with you." The admission stripped the air of every barrier, leaving only truth. He bent his head and kissed her slowly, reverently, as if memorizing the shape of her lips. The kiss deepened a fusion of apology and promise, of desperation and release. When he pulled away, he whispered the question that mattered most. "Are you sure?" Clara's eyes held his, without wavering, her voice clear. "Yes." With careful hands he led her to the bedroom, extinguishing lamps, until the room glowed with only the flicker of firelight and the faint shimmer of candles. He guided her as though she were made of glass, not from fear of breaking her, but from reverence. She shed her fear with each piece of fabric, her heart pounding with anticipation, not dread. He kissed her forehead, her temples, her hands never rushing, never demanding, waiting for her to guide the moment. When she finally pulled him closer, the barriers collapsed completely. Their first night together was not marked by horror, but by healing. There was no cruelty, no conquest, only the quiet miracle of two souls choosing to meet where pain once reigned. When the fire burned low, they lay entangled beneath the sheets, her head resting against his chest. His arm wrapped protectively around her. She whispered into the silence, "I was afraid of this night. Until you." He pressed a kiss to her hair, his voice husky. Love was never the horror. It was the cure. Sleep came slowly, tender and unbroken. The following days were different. Alexander did not retreat behind his mask, and Clara did not shrink into the corners of the mansion. They moved through the house together, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in quiet companionship. Yet they both knew the battle was not over. Richard Blackwood loomed like a shadow over every tender moment. One evening, Alexander summoned his father to the estate. Clara sat beside him in the great hall, her hand firmly in his, as Richard entered with his usual air of disdain. "I see you have chosen defiance," Richard said coldly. "Do you truly believe you can cast aside everything I built for the sake of a girl?" Alexander rose towering yet calm, his voice steady as steel. "You built an empire of fear. I will build one of respect. If that means losing your blessing, so be it." Richard sneered, his eyes flicking to Clara. "She will drag you down." Clara spoke before Alexander could, her voice unwavering. "No, he rises because he finally has something worth fighting for." The silence that followed was thick. Richard's gaze hardened, but for the first time, he seemed to see not just his son, but the woman who refused to cower. With a bitter shake of his head, he turned away. "Then do as you will, but do not expect forgiveness when it crumbles." He left without ceremony, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Clara exhaled shakily, her heart racing. But Alexander squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers with quiet certainty. "We have already won," he said. 3 months later, the estate was transformed, not with marble or chandeliers, but with ribbons, flowers, and music. Friends gathered in the garden behind the old auto garage. Alexander had once rebuilt with his own hands. Clara wore a simple gown, her hair loose, her smile radiant. Alexander stood beside her, in a white shirt sleeves rolled, no tie, looking more handsome than any polished suit had ever made him. The ceremony was intimate, filled with laughter and sincerity. When he placed the ring on her finger, his hands trembled, but his voice did not. "I vow to choose you every day, not because of duty, not because of expectation, but because life without you is no life at all." Clara's eyes shimmered as she whispered her vow in return. "I vow to remind you that love is not weakness, but strength. I vow to walk beside you even when the path is storm." Applause and cheers erupted, but the world shrank to just the two of them, eyes locked, hearts steady. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Alexander led Clara down a narrow path to the beach behind the property. The sand was cool beneath their feet, the waves whispering against the shore. He bent to lift her shoes away and helped her step barefoot onto the sand. She clung to his arm unsteady, but he held her with unwavering strength. "I never thought I would feel this again," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. As her toes sank into the grainy earth, "Every step I take, I want to take with you." He said, his forehead pressing gently to hers. and when you fall, I will be there, always." Together they walked hand in hand, leaving a trail of footprints that the tide could never erase. That night, as the stars bloomed above, and the world settled into silence, Clara leaned against Alexander and breathed deeply of the salt-kissed air. She had entered this marriage trembling with fear, bound by obligation, convinced her life had ended. But in choosing each other, they had discovered that even in the darkest of nights, love could light a fire strong enough to chase away horror. Love was not the weakness Richard Blackwood had claimed. It was strength, courage, and freedom. And as the waves rolled endlessly toward the shore, Clara Hayes Blackwood finally knew with unshakable certainty that her story was no longer one of survival. It was one of beginning.